It's time to throw Wisconsin a bone and remind them that they used to elect some badass politicians. I'm talking, of course, about Fightin Bob LaFollette. Robert Marion LaFollette Sr. was born June 14th, 1855 in Primrose, Wisconsin. Bob grew up on a farm because, it's Wisconsin, but he would go on to attend the University of Wisconsin and get his Bachelor's of Science. In college, he'd meet his future wife, Belle Case, who would go on to become a feminist leader and be very influential on Bob's ideas. After college, LaFollette passed the bar and would go on to run for Dane County District Attorney. With the connections and influence he gained by being District Attorney, he was able to successfully springboard into a congressional bid in 1884. It did not take him long to show his willingness to depart from Republican Party leadership to support more progressive bills, voting for the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Interstate Commerce Act, advocating for more regulation and taxation on the railroads. However, his congressional career was short-lived, as the 1890 election was a slaughter for Republicans, and LaFollette would end up losing his seat. LaFollette decided to go back to Madison and start a private law practice where his boisterous and energetic demeanor earned him the nickname Fightin Bob. During this time, a Republican senator attempted to bribe LaFollette into using his political connections to influence an embezzlement case that a couple Republican officials were currently tied up in. But Fightin Bob was not a man who was for sale. As a result from his frustration from this encounter, he decided to build a coalition of disgruntled Republicans who wanted more accountability, transparency, and progressive policies from the Republican Party. This coalition evolved into LaFollette running for governor in 1894, and he lost. He ran again in 1896 and lost. But Fightin Bob didn't get his name from nothing. He's tenacious, and he ran again in 1898, and this time he got the nomination and lost again. By 1900, his efforts would be rewarded by becoming governor of Wisconsin. Now, one of Bob's struggles in getting his party nomination was the party picked who their general election candidates were going to be. Bob's very first priorities as governor was to get the party nomination set up as a direct election system. Let the people decide who the party's candidate was going to be. Bob was obviously met with some resistance getting direct elections for nominations. But thanks to the coalition of younger progressives that Bob had built years earlier, he was able to garner the support he needed to get it passed. A win for democracy. In addition, he also passed tax reform, most notably doubling the amount of taxes that the railroads paid, and passed more railroad regulation. In 1906, he was appointed senator. It goes without saying that Fightin Bob immediately brought his fighting spirit to the Senate and started campaigning on behalf of progressive senators. He also fought relentlessly for railroad regulation. Through his tenacity and hard work, he eventually got the Railroad Hours Act of 1907 passed, which limited railroad workers from working more than 16 consecutive hours. You just heard that and thought to yourself, it's been over a century and I feel like we're still fighting for the same stupid shit. You'd be right. During LaFollette's first term as senator, Teddy Roosevelt was the president, who was a fellow progressive Republican. LaFollette was initially very excited, believing that a progressive Republican president would be quick to hear and platform his progressive ideals and policies. LaFollette's optimism quickly turned disheartening, as Teddy would often turn down LaFollette's ideas because they were, too progressive. And as sad and frustrating as that is, to be fair, Teddy had to walk a very tight line. Teddy had a long history of picking fights with big people, from the conservative members of his own party to the biggest business moguls in the country. And he knew that he needed to be pragmatic about which things he was willing to go fight for if he wanted to win those fights. Something that was hard for an idealist like LaFollette to understand. Feeling snubbed by the most progressive candidate he was likely to see in the White House, LaFollette would attempt to run for president himself repeatedly in some form or fashion through the rest of his career, which was first a failed attempt to clinch the Republican nomination the following election, which would go to Taft. But with a new president and Howard Taft, there was some new optimism for LaFollette. The Republican Party platform ran on lower tariffs that LaFollette and other progressives said protected big business from competition and raised consumer prices. However, much to his dismay, conservatives ended up getting the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act passed, which largely kept those tariffs intact, with the help of the president, who LaFollette was hopeful was going to be more progressive. Again. It wasn't a total loss because LaFollette and fellow progressives were able to get the 16th Amendment ratified, which allowed the federal government to levy federal income tax. Following LaFollette's senatorial re-election in 1911, he decided to launch the National Progressive Republicans League, which I feel like Sean Connery must have been an integral part of. The league focused on passing and platforming progressive legislation like primary elections, direct elections of senators, referendums, and with support from 16 congressmen, 9 senators, 4 governors, and a handful of influential individuals, individuals, the League actually did have a fair amount of success. By 1912, La Follette would once again try to secure the Republican nomination, running against Taft with the support of progressives, and things were looking pretty promising for him, until Teddy Roosevelt decided again that he wanted to not be president anymore, and also threw his hat back in the ring for the Republican nomination. Teddy's progressive history and massive name recognition immediately took a bunch of La Follette's support. In fact, many people, even in his own league, would encourage La Follette to drop out of the race and endorse Teddy, something La Follette refused to do and ended up burning a lot of bridges. Not long after, suffering from a combination of frustration that his hopes got repeatedly dashed, and his daughter undergoing some health issues, La Follette would end up throwing a bit of a fit, a tantrum, if you will, in the form of a 2-hour-long speech yelling at people and complaining. His episode is largely considered to be the downfall and death knell of his 1912 presidential hopes. This fracture and infighting within the Republican Party all but assured that Woodrow Wilson would be the next president, unfortunately. Once again, ever the optimist, La Follette was looking for new inroads with a new president. Woodrow Wilson, being anything but progressive and having enough Democratic control to not give a fuck what Republicans were doing, just didn't care about him. So La Follette continued his lonely fight alone again. He ended up being the only Republican to vote for the 1913 Revenue Act that got the tariffs lowered that he'd been fighting for, and then turned around and voted against the Federal Reserve Act, fought with Southern Democrats trying to steal agricultural benefits from African Americans. He fought for sailors' ability to be able to quit at any port they saw fit. Prior to this, being a sailor made you an indentured servant for all practical purposes. Also got it passed so lifeboats were a requirement on ships. 400-something years of people sailing the oceans, that wasn't a priority. He went on to oppose America's involvement in the First World War, opposed the United Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. He opposed the draft, and he called out Wilson for the Espionage Act, the legislation that would allow Wilson to lock up anybody he didn't like or spoke out against him, like Eugene Debs. He would initially support the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. Despite his early support, he maintained that the United States should remain completely uninvolved in the Russian Civil War. His positions would end up earning him the ire of Teddy Roosevelt, who took a very shoot first, ask questions later approach to foreign policy. Anyway, the war ended, Wilson stroked out, Harding became the nominee. La Follette pursued a third-party bid for president, but as usual, when trying to find support for it, progressives couldn't get their shit together, so La Follette stayed in the Senate. Again, La Follette went back to work, fighting for farm aid. After the Supreme Court struck down a federal child labor law in favor of big business, La Follette went to work trying to take some of the power away from the Supreme Court, which obviously was unsuccessful, and some things never fucking change. Follette was also the one who opened up the investigations that blew open the Teapot Dome scandal. Just didn't want to get bribed when Bob was around. And the 1924 election rolled around, and he decided he was going to run for president again. He'd already created a coalition at one point and a league at one point. It was time for a conference. The Conference of Progressive Political Action, an umbrella organization for left-leaning and progressive political groups. Gaining support and ideas for policies for the new CPPA, he went to Europe, and this is where he discovered he wasn't maybe as big a fan of the Bolsheviks. He visited England and got inspired by some third-party political bids there. He stopped in and visited Mussolini, and apparently to his face told him he was being a dick about limiting the free press. And as he rolled into campaign season, his campaign enjoyed some really good early energy. However, progressives suck at doing things. Progressive groups that thought that their most important issue was the most important issue, and they were willing to fight the other progressives over the issues that they thought were the most important issue. It's a perennial problem. And as a result, he didn't have a lot of cohesive support for his campaign. Furthermore, he hurt the fifis of a secret organization that mostly likes cosplaying as ghosts during times of the year that are not Halloween by denouncing racial discrimination and immigration quotas that favored white people. Oh, and saying directly that their little club contained the seeds of death. Those actions and comments would earn him the title of Enemy of the Country from a grand wizard whose only magic trick is making people sad. Now today, I think most people would consider it a win to have effectively pissed off the wizards and ghosts playing Dungeons and Discrimination, but in 1924, the organization carried a little bit more respect and weight, and sadly lacking their endorsement usually meant that you had no chance in certain regions of the country. Nonetheless, he won 16.6% of the vote, a very respectable showing. Just a few short months later, on June 18th, 2025, 4 days after his 70th birthday, Fightin Bob La Follette would sadly lose his last fight to cardiovascular disease. Fightin Bob's legacy, though, would continue fighting on. His son was elected to to his Senate seat, and his wife would continue to be an influential activist. His youngest son, Philip, would follow in his father's footsteps, eventually becoming governor of Wisconsin. Another one of his sons would go on to be Wisconsin's attorney general, and his daughter would go on to be a leader in the suffragette movement. His family basically went on to be like the Kennedys of Wisconsin, except without the money and all the dying. Speaking of the Kennedys, JFK selected Bob LaFollette to be one of 5 senators featured in the Senate Hall of Fame. Fightin Bob has also been called the greatest senator in U.S. history and the most celebrated figure in Wisconsin. And to this day, there is a Fightin Bob festival held annually in Madison, Wisconsin. So come on, Wisconsin, you think anybody's gonna look back in 100 years and be making videos like this about Paul Ryan or Ron Johnson? Nah. Get your shit together and get more Fightin Bobs representing you.